Welcome to Mrs. Feighery's video number 2, Chapter 36, The Cold War Begins. Following the war, there was a post-war baby boom. Many soldiers returned to their sweethearts and married them after the war, had babies, and created a baby boom that would be felt for generations. As the children grew up collectively, they put strains on respective markets, such as manufacturers of baby products in the 40s and 50s, teenage clothing designers in the 60s, and the job market in the 70s and 80s. They grew into teenagers who spent $20 billion a year on clothes and music. They became the foundation of the youth movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. By around 2020, they will place enormous strains on the Social Security system. Presiding after World War II was Harry S. Truman, who had come to power following the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had died from a massive brain hemorrhage. He was the first president in a long time without a college education, and Truman at first approached his burdens with humility, but he gradually evolved into a confident, cocky politician. His cabinet was made up of the old Missouri gang, which was composed of Truman's friends from when he was a senator in Missouri. Oftentimes, Truman would stick to a wrong decision just to prove his decisiveness and power of command. However, even if he was small on the small things, he was big on the big things, taking responsibility very seriously and working very hard. A final conference of the Big Three had taken place at Yalta in February of 1945, and agreements had been made at that conference. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, pledged that Poland should have a representative government with free elections, as would Bulgaria and Romania. But Stalin was not to keep those promises. At Yalta, the Soviet Union had also agreed to attack Japan 3 months after the fall of Germany in exchange for territorial concessions. Occupation zones in Germany would be assigned to each of the victorious great powers, and a new international peacekeeping organization called the United Nations would be set up. By the time the Soviets entered the Pacific War, the U.S. was about to win anyway, and now it seemed that Russia had entered for only the sake of taking the spoils of war. The Soviet Union was also granted control of the Manchurian railroads and received special privileges to Darien and Port Arthur. Critics of Roosevelt charged that he'd sold China's Chiang Kai-shek down the river. Supporters claimed that the Soviets could have taken more of China than they had wished, and that the Yalta agreements had actually limited the Soviet Union in its expansionary efforts. With the USA and the USSR as the only world superpowers after World War II, trouble seemed imminent. The U.S. had waited until 1933 to recognize the Soviet Union. The U.S. and Britain had delayed opening up a second front during the World War II, which placed a tremendous strain on the Soviet Union. The United States and Britain had frozen the Soviets out of developing nuclear arms. And the U.S. had also withdrawn its vital Lend-Lease program from the Soviet Union in 1945 and spurned Moscow's plea for $6 billion in reconstructive aid while approving a similar $3.75 billion loan to Berlin. Stalin wanted a protective spear around Western Russia, for twice earlier in the century Russia had been attacked from that very direction, and that meant taking nations like Poland under its control as a buffer zone. Even though both the USA and the Soviet Union were recent newcomers to the world stage, they were both very advanced and had been isolationists before the 20th century. But now they found themselves in a political stare-down that would turn into the Cold War and last for 4.5 decades. However, the U.S. did manage to establish structures that were part of FDR's open world. At a meeting at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, the Western Allies established the International Monetary Fund to encourage world trade by regulating the currency exchange rates. The United Nations opened on April 25, 1945. The member nations drew up a charter similar to that to the old League of Nations, formed a Security Council to be headed by 5 permanent powers: China, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and the United States. And they had total veto powers, and this was headquartered in New York City. The Senate overwhelmingly approved the United Nations by a vote of 89-2. Very different than when this was attempted during the World War I time period. The UN kept peace in Kashmir and other trouble spots, created the new Jewish state of Israel, formed such groups as UNESCO, which stands for the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, and these organizations brought benefits to people all over the globe and continue to do so. The U.S. delegate Bernard Barak called in 1946 for a UN agency free from the great power veto that could investigate all nuclear facilities and weapons. This proposal was not followed up on and was rejected by the Soviet Union, since it didn't want to give up its veto power and was opposed to capitalist spies snooping around in the Soviet Union. As a result of not being able to put anything into place to provide oversight for nuclear development, the small window of regulating nuclear weapons was lost. And we'll see how this impacts the Cold War as it develops in our daily lessons. This is the Works Cited page. All of the images in this presentation are taken from the public domain.